all things to the glory of your great name, and we thank you for that. We also ask now for your blessing upon Dr. Legates as he speaks to us. Help us to be alert, to stay awake, to concentrate, and shape us by your truth. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you once again. Outside on the table, there is a box labeled free. Nobody has been taking the stuff from the free box, so I'm going to start charging for it so that they'll go away. It's a brochure on clear thinking about climate change. They will do me no good sitting in my garage, so make sure you take enough of them so the box is empty by the end of the conference. And I'm also going to apologize to Pastor Bradley because I said that usually I was going to stomp on people's toes, or I was going to tread on people's toes, and now I'm really going to stomp all over his today. But hopefully, like I said, it'll give more depth to what we're talking about as opposed to just simply seeing things from a one-dimensional standpoint. And would sort of be better to hear from him first than to hear from just me. Today, we're going to move on to part two. Part two is how humans are to interact in a godly manner with the rest of creation. Some time ago, I got into a discussion with an evangelical Christian climatologist. Well, I shouldn't say it was a discussion, because as I found, people on that side don't like to discuss. Once they find you disagree with them, they usually shut you up and go away. So it wasn't really a discussion in that sense. It was sort of me making comments to what she had said, and that was sort of the way it ended. But in any event, she said that, climate change is an existential threat to the planet, and as Christians, we really need to be doing all we can to stop climate change, because after all, creation is the second greatest gift to mankind. Now, she never mentioned what the first greatest gift is, and I think we all know what that is, and I'll give her the benefit of the doubt, because if she didn't get the right answer, then I would really question her characterization of herself as an evangelical Christian. But I got to thinking about what is the second greatest gift. So I went back to Genesis 2. And in Genesis 2, we essentially see where God creates things and he creates man, and then he brings to Adam all of the beasts of the field, all of the living things, and has him name them. And God said that it was good, but it wasn't, in the mathematical lingo, it wasn't a sufficient condition. He needed something else. So what was that something else? Well, of course, that was Eve, a helper, other humans. And when I think back to Matthew 22, creation in general is never really mentioned. What's really mentioned is put God first and then care for other human beings. So my argument is that God's second greatest gift is in fact other human beings, not the whole of creation. But any event, let's see. I want to also start with the parable of the talents. You've heard this numerous times, so you're going to hear it again. Just to recap, what happened is a master is leaving for some time period, and he calls his 3 servants in, and he gives one 5 talents, one 2 talents, and one 1, and away he goes. And after a time, he comes back, and he calls them in for some form of assessment as to what's happened, what they've done with them. The one with 5 talents says, here are 5 talents. And here's 5 more. It's made. Well done, a good and faithful servant. The one with 2 does the same thing. Here's your 2 talents back, and here's 2 more. It's made. Well done, thou good and faithful servant. The one with 1 talent comes along, and he says, well, something funny happened. I did some research, and there was a sure winner at the 5th race, camel race at Haifa. And so I took it, and I bet on that horse. And well, Big Bertha was way out ahead of everybody. But coming around that last turn, she was 10, 12 lengths ahead. She broke a leg, down they went. They had to put her away. Unfortunately, she lost. And so I don't have any of your money left. I gave it a shot. Sorry. Well, it's not really what happened. I wonder what the response of the master would have been if that happened. But he said, look, I was afraid, so here's what I did. I put it in the ground. Let me go get it for you. Here it is. Here, just as you gave it to me. Here it is back. You haven't lost anything. You gave me 1 talent, I'm giving you 1 talent back. You have what is yours. But instead, he was a wicked and lazy slave. So the question is that most people focus on various other things, but what really struck me with that story was what he did with it. It could have said he kept it on his person to guard it. It could have said he hid it under his bed. He could have done all sorts of things to protect it. He hid it in the ground. Now, as I look in through climate change, what I start to see is that much of the world's fossil fuel really needs to be kept in the ground to keep global warming below some unbelievable level of 1.5 degrees Celsius. I can tell you, if we turn the thermostat up 1.5 degrees Celsius in here, you'd never know. And you see this all over the place. Keep it in the ground. In fact, there's a hashtag running on social media, hashtag keep it in the ground, so that we don't use fossil fuels because apparently they're destroying things. And I think the parallel between what we're supposed to do with resources to help people to glorify God and keeping the talent in the ground by the wicked slave and what we're now being told to do with energy is just amazing, because as we'll see, it is inexpensive energy that is going to pull people from poverty. And that is the key. And what we're doing by keeping it in the ground is literally putting them into poverty and working against the second great commandment. Now, we also argue that natural resources are indeed gifts from God. In Deuteronomy 8:7-10, you can see that what happens here is they're about to go into the promised land. It's not Eden, but it's as close to Eden as you're going to get after the fall. And God says, for the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, a land of streams and water, of fountains and springs, flowing out of valleys and hills, a land of wheat and barley, of vines, fig trees, of pomegranates, a land of olive oil and honey, a land where you eat food without shortage, in which you will not lack for anything. This is, like I said, short of Eden, this is paradise. But then it goes on. A land whose stones are iron, out of whose hills you can dig copper. We're not supposed to take stuff out of the ground. Well, yes, we are, because that's part of what the promised land contained. You wouldn't see these people coming back and say, okay, this is all well and good, but you'd better not drink any wine. Also, figs, they're off. Not going to allow you to eat that. We wouldn't do that. They didn't do that. So why should we do that here? Now, I get it. If you really think, and if we can prove that we are destroying the environment, then we should do what we can to stop it. But I'm going to argue later this week that's not the case. And in particular, as I said, as we're commanded to do in Matthew 22, put God first and then make sure you treat everyone else as equal. And we can't do that if we take resources they need and keep them from using it. Same thing happened in Job 28, 1-6. Certainly there is a mine for silver and a place for refining gold. Iron is taken from the dust and copper is smelted from rock. Clearly, natural resources are gifts from God, so that to be treated as gifts from God and to be used as gifts from God. Now, as I said, energy is something that we definitely need, inexpensive energy, to bring people out of poverty. Let's look at people in abject poverty. They're using what we call a primitive energy system. And what is that energy system? The energy source they use, I hate to say it just after breakfast, but wood and animal dung. Okay, that is the energy source that many people around the planet have to use. What do they use it for? Well, how do they get it, I should say? They gather and transport on the backs of women and children. The men are out trying to get food. Men are out trying to get food. Meanwhile, the women and children are out collecting dung, out collecting wood so they can cook the food. The labor costs, it takes them much of the day, 6 to 8 hours to go around and find all this stuff. What do they use it for? Well, the only thing you can really use it for is cooking and heating. and they cook it on open fires, most of which are inside of the little huts. The resulting pollution creates smoke. Because it's indoors and they breathe it, it creates asthma and other respiratory diseases. In fact, the World Health Organization estimates the fact that the smoke from burning dung kills 2 to 4 million people a year. And as you've probably guessed, most of them are going to be women and young children. Particularly the young children are susceptible, but the women and young children are in the huts more than the men are, and they're breathing this more often. The benefits of what they get barely outweigh the costs. It's really, that's why we call it subsistence living. You're just barely breaking even. The modern energy system works entirely differently. Fossil fuels, nuclear, hydroelectric, wind, solar, we've got lots of different ways to choose energy. Geothermal, I didn't mention. Some are available in some places, some are available in others. How do we get them? We drill into the ground, we refine them, we use trucks, rail lines, transmission lines to move it around. How long does it take you a day to acquire your energy needs? Almost no time at all, minutes at most. What do you use it for? Well, heating and cooking, but also for cooling. Also for refrigeration. It's one of the, if we have a little bit of energy in third world countries, they can use it to refrigerate food and make it last longer. The problem is always, what do you do with old food? Do you eat it and run the risk of getting sick, or do you throw it away and lose what you'd had? I don't know, but you have that choice. Well, if you have refrigeration, we can keep it for another day. You've got medical technology, you've got transportation, communication, industry, commerce, and even recreation. Why is it that, for example, sports such as English football didn't appear until the late 1800s? Because we didn't have free time to spend on recreational purposes. That's why most sports came about very recently. A little bit later on, I'm from the East Coast, so we play lacrosse from time to time, and that's an old sport, but in many cases, a lot of the new organized sports came on much later. The resulting pollution is ironically minimal by comparison, particularly if you're living in a hut where you're using dung for cooking. The pollution you get from your house is a whole lot less, and the benefits clearly outweigh the costs. What has that done for us? This is the world population. It's gone from about 1 billion in 1820 to almost 4 billion in 1970. You'll notice in red is the number of people living in extreme or abject poverty. It also increased. And surprisingly, maybe not surprisingly, most of the people living back in the early 1800s were living in abject poverty. And that number increased. Well, you probably guessed what could happen up until 2015, which is when this graph will end. We get more than 7 billion people on the planet. We're pushing now 8 billion. What happened to the number of people in abject poverty? It went through the, no, it didn't. What happened? It didn't go through the roof. It turned and went down. Not only did it go down in terms of percentage, it went down in terms of actual numbers. Why did that happen? I'll show you this graph. Here it shows you in 1820, you can see, what is that, 79%? Actually, I like this one better. 79% of the people are living in abject poverty in 1820. It dropped to 9% in 2018. That's a good thing. We are accomplishing Matthew 22. If you'll notice, the share living on less than $3.65 a day has cut in half from 58% to 25%. The share living on less than $6.85 a day has gone from 68 to 47. The share living on less than $30 a day hasn't changed much, but that's okay. The biggest change is at the bottom of the spectrum. It's not the close to rich have gotten rich, although they have. It's that the very far away from rich have gotten a little less poor, and quite a bit less poor. This is exactly what you would like to see if you really care about people. So our conclusion is The demand that the poor and developing countries forego the use of abundant, reliable, affordable, scalable, dispatchable energy, largely from fossil fuels, the source of 85% of all the world's energy, in favor of more expensive, less reliable, less abundant, less scalable, and non-dispatchable energy from wind, solar, and other renewables. And I wish I had time to explain to you the problem associated with wind and solar. There's serious, serious problems with it. But in any event, it means slowing, stopping, or reversing the conquest of poverty. How did we get there? We increased technology, and how did we do that? The energy allowed us time to develop technology. And getting away from poverty allows you the additional money, the additional ability to develop technology. The problem is the demand of the poor is going to trap billions into poverty and force hundreds of millions back into it. As Cal goes on to say, but poverty is far greater than anything related to climate or weather. With income comparable to the bottom 10th of Americans, people can thrive in any climate, from the Arctic Circle to the Sahara Desert to the Brazilian rainforest. With income equivalent to $2 a day, they can't possibly thrive even in the best tropical paradise. If you really care about people, your goal should be getting them out of poverty. Consequently, the quest to mitigate climate change simply cannot justify the demand. So, back to our 30 theses, number 15 says, we affirm that one way of exercising godly dominion is by transforming raw materials into resources and using them to meet human needs. We deny that leaving everything in the earth in its natural state, as the wicked slave did, is proper biblical stewardship. As he said in Matthew 25, the wicked slave says, I was afraid and hid your talent in the ground. Again, for me, the hid your talent in the ground stuck out. I mean, many people miss that because it doesn't mean to them. With the comparison that I see from fossil fuels in the ground, it really stuck out quite a bit. Now I'm walking on toes. Back in, I don't know when it was, a couple years ago, I guess, I wrote an article for Town Hall called The Experiment. See, as a scientist, we use experiments all the time. We can, for example, put stuff in petri dishes. We can then put an antibiotic on one side and a different type of antibiotic on the other and see how they behave. And we can compare one for the other. What if we could do the same with economic systems? We could take a country and completely destroy it. How would you do that? We could do a natural disaster. No, it won't work. We could do widespread pestilence. No, the best way to do it is war. War can destroy a country and send it back almost to the beginning of civilization. And unfortunately, we've done that numerous times. So what if we could take a country and break it into two parts, and then take one country, one part of the country, one half of it, and bring it up in a command economy, and bring the other half up in a capitalist economy? Let it play out for, let's say, 50 years or so. See what happens. We've done that several times. And, of course, the classic example that I'll use here is, I'm going the wrong direction, would help if I put the right button, is Germany. That's the old German flag. So Germany, after World War II, was split into two parts. One of them called the German Democratic Republic. Question, German Democratic Republic is West Germany? German Democratic Republic is East Germany. Very good. Most people are saying East. That's good. Most people think it's West Germany because it's a democratic republic. So a democracy and a republic must be the capital society. It must be us. It's not. That's the way socialists operate. They rename things to weird stuff, as we heard last night. So the German Federal Republic is West Germany. It was rebuilt in the image of its Western allies, using a capitalist legal system, and the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany, was reconstructed using the socialist communist principles championed by, of course, the Soviet Union. So the experiment in Germany pitted the market economy of the West against the command economy of the East. Now, what was supposed to happen? As I said, I live in academic circles, so academics knew exactly what was going to happen. What was going to happen in West Germany was that greedy capitalism was going to create a state where the few people became the rich, the vast majority were going to be left as the deprived masses. The elites would lord over the great unwashed with an iron corporate fist. By contrast, socialism would promise the best living through rights guaranteed by the state, and this would include human rights to employment, living wages, daycare, time for rest and leisure, health care, elder care, and guaranteed cultural programs, housing, education. It'll take care of everything for you, and everything in a more efficient way because it's got us all under the same umbrella. The evil capitalist state would create an environment that simply would degrade extensively because capitalism would consume all available resources and just simply leave behind the waste on the landscape. Meanwhile, the environment would thrive under the command economy because the state would provide the necessary oversight for proper maintenance. So we let this run for about 45 years until, of course, one of the two collapsed, and then they merged again. So what happened? Well, in West Germany, capitalism rebuilt the country essentially into a regional power that was only rivaled by its former competitor, Great Britain. West Germans thrived, the country developed economically, its people enjoyed lives with all the pleasures that wealth, modern technologies, and quality free time could provide. By contrast, East Germany's socialist policies created a state that fell woefully behind. Its people were much poorer. Property ownership was virtually non-existent, a collectivist regime. Food and material goods were just scarce, expensive, available mostly to Communist Party elites. Spies were everywhere, and people were summarily arrested and jailed. The state pretended to pay its workers, and they pretended to work. As Colin Grabau wrote, after the reunification of East Germany, 42% of moving water and 24% of still waters were so polluted they could not be used to process drinking water. Almost half of the country's lakes were unable to sustain fish or other forms of life. Only 1/3 of industrial sewage, along with half of domestic sewage, received any kind of treatment. In some areas of East Germany, the level of air pollution was between 8 and 12 times greater than that found in West Germany. Pastor Bradley showed an example with Boris Yeltsin. I saw exactly the same thing, but in reverse. I was invited to the Soviet Union in 1990, and I went with several people, one of whom was George Kukla, and he had, in 1990, a video machine. And so we went down the street to a grocery store. So we went into the grocery store, and he started filming, and I wish I had that video. I don't have any idea whatever happened to it. But we went in, and against one wall were 2 chickens. I know they're chickens because Delaware's a big chicken-producing state. But I also knew they were chickens because the head, beak, feet, everything, and feathers were all still attached. The weird thing about it was the chicken was that tall and about that big around. We went down the row of food. And there must have been, I think, 8 cans of beets. There must have been 6 cans of diced beets. I think there were maybe 5 cans of sliced beets. There were 7 cans of beeted beets. And that was it. There were about 10 people in the store. And of course, a commotion started because George had this big, at the 1990s, they were huge. It wasn't like your cell phone now, but he had a big video machine. So the manager came out from the back, and she asked him to put it away. And she must have weighed 350 pounds. Now, I guess she was probably not eating beets or chickens. Or if she was eating an awful lot of them. But, of course, she was one of the party people. And so That's why she was in charge. George turned the video off, and she smiled. That's when I saw that she had a mouthful of metal teeth. The other people had few teeth. She had them all replaced with metal teeth. And like I said, I wish I had that video. But any event. So I know what Boris Yeltsin was looking at from the other side. He knew exactly what I saw and was surprised to see stocked grocery stores. I mean, this grocery store had far less in it than I would see, pending hurricane landfall along the coast. Any event. Thomas Sowell quoted, "Socialism is a wonderful idea. It is only a reality that it has been disastrous. Among people of every race, color, and creed all around the world, socialism has led to hunger in countries that used to have surplus food to export. Nevertheless, for many of those who deal primarily in ideas, read academia, socialism remains an attractive idea, in fact, seductive. Its every failure is explained away as due to the inadequacies of particular leaders." I've got a running gag with a friend of mine. He always says, "I'm afraid this country's slipping to socialism." And I always say, "John, don't worry about it. This time it'll work. I know it's never worked in the past. We're going to get it right this time." And of course, the joke is, well, it's not really a joke because unfortunately we are headed towards socialism and they're not going to get it right this time because they've never gotten it right in the past and it's just not possible to get it right. Sowell also said, "No government of the left has ever done as much for the poor as capitalism has. Even when it comes to the redistribution of income, the left talks the talk, but the free market walks the walk. What do the poor most need? They need to stop being poor. And how can that be done on a mass scale except by an economy that creates vastly more wealth? As far as the political left are concerned, wealth exists somehow, and the only interesting question is how to redistribute it." See, the difference in capitalism says we can build wealth, we can make more, we can all become wealthy, we can pull everybody out of poverty. Socialism says, no, there's just a fixed amount of wealth, and it's up to me, the government, to redistribute it among all of us equally, so that we all have what we call equity. Now I'm going to go down a rabbit hole here for a moment. I have an issue with referring to things as left and right, because usually when we refer to them as left, we think communist. When we refer to them as right, we think fascist. And everybody gets the impression these are diametrically opposites, and they're not. What I want you to do is on your piece of paper, draw a triangle. I want you to put the point down at the bottom and a straight line across the top. So it's a triangle, and if you made it an arrow, it would be pointing downwards. At the bottom, write the word anarchy. And at the top, write the word totalitarianism. I know it's a big word. What does it mean? Well, as the word implies, total government control. So as you move up on your triangle, you're getting more and more government control until you get to the top. Across the top, I want you to write monarchy, despotism, dictatorship, fascism, communism, oligarchy. Why are they all in the same place? Because they're all the same thing. It's only a question of who is the ruling class. An oligarchy is ruled by the elites. The monarchy is ruled by a family. The fascism, despotism, dictatorship are usually ruled by somebody that organizes a bunch of people to work for them. The Politburo essentially runs communism, so it's a group of people. It's just who is the elite, small group of elite that runs the thing. Now, the reason I object to this left-right fascism versus communism thing is because the classic fascism, and it's not a good example, the classic, every time everybody thinks of fascism, is Nazis. Where did the word Nazi come from? Very good. So the idea, it's an alliteration of the NSDAP, which is the German equivalent of National Socialist German Workers' Party. Wait a sec. Socialist. What was the Soviet Union? The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. They're both socialists. Nazis are socialist, and the communists were socialists. It's just that the communists were global socialists. The Nazis were natural socialists. And to drive home the point, the Nazis had Workers' Party thrown in there. Always the left refers to workers of the world unite. Yeah, it's Workers' Party. So they really aren't at opposite ends of the extreme. They are one, they're sort of like brothers in totalitarianism. Sorry, as I said, that bothers me no end. So, Cal has written a number of books if you're interested. None of them are on the back table, but you can still get them through our website on poverty, growth, and is capitalism bad for the environment? And what I want to do is talk briefly about the 5 environmental charges against capitalism. One is that capitalism is indifferent to nature. Nature is there to be exploited. It's not. Capitalism sees pollution as violence, harming people or their property without their consent. Capitalism offers strict liability, which uses common law court action to limit pollution. The result is a price on pollution that reflects free choices of the people affected, and it's difficult to think of a better way to handle the problem. Number 2, capitalism promotes consumerism and unending economic growth. But what defines capitalism isn't growth, but it's in fact the use of market prices to signal where raw materials, labor, capital, and product are most valued, and then allowing them to move to that location. While this doesn't involve consuming more raw materials, it doesn't necessarily require it. As Noah Smith said, simple theories that are used to justify free markets don't even have growth in them. Capitalism works because people gain from trade, not because they have more and more to trade over time. It's efficiency, not growth, that is the gold ring. Number 3, capitalism leads to resource depletion and ecosystem damage. Predicted resource exhaustions have always failed to materialize. You ever heard about peak oil? They keep talking about we have found more than half of the oil that exists, and we're starting to run out of oil. We're not. They keep finding more and more and more. And the way you know that we haven't run out of stuff yet is the long-term price trends in all extractive resources are downward, which means they're becoming less scarce and not more scarce over time. This is because in a free market economy, people don't consume resources, they also make them. And on average, they're making more than they consume. At the least, capitalism better delays resource depletion than does socialism because the value of a depleting item would actually increase. Number 4, capitalism enterprises generate harmful externalities. Externalities are unjust costs put on others. Externalities are not a market failure, but a government failure. And in fact, coming up tomorrow, I will talk about the externalities of fossil fuel use, and you'll see why carbon dioxide may actually be a benefit and not the existential gas that's threatening the planet. Number 5, capitalism's short-term focus blinds it to long-term costs. Capitalism offers a way of accounting today for future value, as you mentioned, the discount rate. So why accept an environmentalist assessment of value over someone else's? Because economic value is subjective. Ask again, compared to what? Is socialism or any other economic system better at assessing future value of present environmental features? There is no perfect economic system, and we'll talk about risk later. There is no risk-free world. There is biblical support for capitalism's ethical system. Capitalism's historical record is far better than its competitors. It's not perfect, but it is better than its competitors. No other system better protects or improves the natural environment, and no other system equally well raises and keeps people out of poverty, which, as we said, should be our ultimate goal. So number 17, we affirm that man is accountable to God's judgment in all that he does with the earth, and we deny that man's accountability to God justifies abolishing private property, adopting collectivist economic institutions, or delegating to civil governments, whether local, national, or global, ownership or control of land, natural resources, or private property. We've seen before, 20% of the 10 Commandments refer to things that are owned by others. Thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not covet. Well, if it's global ownership, if we're all owned equally, you can't steal because we all own it. You can't covet it because we all own it. Well, clearly it's saying there are things that should be owned or will be owned by individuals. It's referring directly to private property in a sense, and we deny that God justifies abolishing private property. Number 16, we affirm that because of man's fall into sin, sinful human hearts often fall prey to materialism, the covetous love of money, and the selfish accumulation of possessions. As Luke 6:10 says, "For the love of money is a root of all sorts of evil, and some by longing for it have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs." Colossians 3:5, "Therefore treat the parts of your earthly body as dead to sexual immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, and greed, which amounts to idolatry." We deny that the temptation to a materialist idolatry entails that the production of wealth, whether material from the earth or immaterial from the human mind, is sinful in and of itself. Number 18, we affirm that man's fall into sin, Genesis 3, entails the possibility, indeed the historical reality, of human abuse of the earth and fellow humans. We are now fallen beings. We're going to do things we shouldn't do. So somebody's going to abuse the capitalist system. But we deny that man's fall into sin completely destroys the possibility of godly dominion. Why doesn't everybody care about the environment? If you look at India, for example, the Brahmaputra River Basin, the Ganges River Basin, they use both of them for drinking water. They use both of them to get rid of wastewater. Why would you do that? Because there's 4 things you need. You need food, you need clothes, you need shelter, and you need safety. Those are fundamental. If you don't have them, you will do everything you can. Protecting your environment is a costly good. It takes money and energy and time to do it. And if you don't have these 4, these are going to trump caring about your environment. Once you get food, so that you don't have to worry about it, once you have sufficient clothing, once your shelter is taking place, and once you have safety secured, then you can start to look at other things. But not until then. So, number 26 says, we affirm that because a clean, safe, healthful, beautiful environment is a costly good, wealthy societies can better afford environmental protection and restoration than poor societies. We deny that economic development is per se a threat to environmental quality. Just because we are developing economically doesn't mean that environmental quality has to go downhill. And we'll talk about that more in part 3. Now, I often taught courses in water resources. And there we talked about something called the tragedy of the commons. This is Aristotle. What is common to the greatest number gets the least amount of care. Men pay most attention to what is their own. They care less for what is common. How many people have seen graffiti on public bathrooms? Not this one, of course. No, this isn't public anyway. But no, and don't start that either. But yeah, why? It's a common. It's a public restroom. How many people have graffiti on the bathroom at home? Yeah, your mother would be smacking you upside the head if you did. You do not. Hopefully not. Any event, no, people care for what they have. When it's public, why should I care about it? Somebody else will take care of it. That's the tragedy of the commons. It was a concept put forth by Garrett Hardin in 1968, which is used to explain a human perspective that leads to resource mismanagement and conflict. Actually, you've seen Garrett Hardin before. He wrote the foreword to the book, Do Trees Have Standing? 4 years later, actually. What do we mean by commons? As the name implies, it's common to everyone. It can be public land. The Boston Commons was an area nobody could own. It was there for grazing. When they finally got the cattle out of town, it became an area where people could just lounge around. But it can also be air, it can be water, anything that we assume is going to be the public or a public resource. The classic example of the tragedy of the commons is the early years of Plymouth Plantation. Bradford wrote, that each person was to put into the commons all he could and take out only what he needed. You know what that says? Each according to his ability, each according to his or her need. Where have you heard that before? Yeah, you heard it this morning. It's socialism, it's communism. It's the way it works. We're all going to get together, and so we're all going to work for the common good. So I want everybody to produce things as much as they can and then take just whatever you need. Suppose you can produce more than other people. Well, we are Christians. We are hopefully helping each other. But suppose we're doing this on a larger secular society. You can produce far more than you really need. What is the incentive to do so? There isn't. And that's the problem. That's the tragedy of the commons. So what happened in Plymouth Plantation, Bradford reported the colonists went hungry for years because they refused to work in the fields. They instead preferred to steal food. It was easier to steal it. Why? Because young and strong men complained about being forced to spend their time and strength to work for other men's wives and children. Why should I work for somebody else? So they refused to work, and so the amount of food produced for the entire colony was never enough. But in 1623, Bradford gave each household a parcel of land and said they could keep what they produced or trade it away. Or just not produce as much as only as much as you need. You can do whatever you want with it, but it's yours. In other words, it's no longer the command economy, it's a capitalist economy. And you have the freedom of choice. He wrote, the harvest of 1623 was different. Instead of famine, now God gave them plenty. Other colonies, such as Jamestown, actually went through the same scenario. When they tried to work together, it never happened. People in the secular world, and in some places in the Christian world, won't work together for the common good. There is no incentive. But in capitalism, there is an incentive. You can get a reward from your labor. You will produce more. You'll try to figure out a way to do it more efficiently, to get more from it. And that's innovation, that's technological development. Number 27, we affirm that private ownership of land and other resources, because it harnesses God-given human incentives to overcome the tragedy of the commons, is the best institutional economic system for environmental protection. We deny that collectivist economic systems are equally good at protecting or improving natural environments. But don't collectivist societies generally see the larger picture? Can't they work generally for the common good? There's a story that came out in China, 1958. It's called the Four Pests Campaign. Mao decided that he was going to rid the nation of the four main pests. They are mosquitoes, flies, sparrows, and rats. And you can see here's a picture of a boy showing all the sparrows he's caught and killed. There's a truck full of sparrows they're carting off. I'm thinking back to the biblical thing about not a one sparrow falls without God's knowledge. But in any event, this is supposed to be a good idea. We're going to rid everything, or rid the country, of these four pests. And what happened? Well, what happened was, in fact, the sparrows were eating insects. The insects started to thrive because there were no sparrows to eat them. And so they started to eat grain. Well, that was the problem, is the sparrows were eating grain. Now you've got more and more insects eating the grain. You've got even less food than you had before. And that led to what's known now as the Great Leap Forward famine, in which nearly 30 million people died of starvation. Now, I'm not saying capitalism hasn't done bad things. We have. We are fallen people. But it's this collectivist idea that doesn't necessarily work. You assume everybody works for the common good, and the common good is accomplished. In many cases, it's not. What they're trying to do actually creates other problems. So we affirm that local, this is 28, we affirm that local, constitutionally limited, responsive governments by the consent of the governed are better suited to environmental stewardship than central, unlimited governments without regard to the consent of the governed. And we deny that socialism, fascism, communism, and other forms of collectivist expansionist government offer better solutions to environmental risks than limited, free, constitutional governments with market economies. Number 19, see, I told you I wouldn't do them in order. We affirm that in response to man's sin, God cursed the ground so that it would not, as before, yield easily even to godly dominion, cultivation, let alone to ungodly, abusive domination, and indeed subjected the whole cosmos to decay and corruption until he restores it partially in history by obedience to the dominion mandate, whether by the unregenerate through common grace or by the regenerate through special grace, and fully in the new heavens and the new earth in the eschaton, all secured by the redeeming work of Christ. I'll let you work through that one later. We deny, due to God's faithfulness to his covenant in which he proclaimed after the flood, that he would sustain the cycles on which terrestrial life depends for as long as the earth endures, that God's curse on the earth negates either the dominion mandate or the robustness and self-correcting resilience of the God-sustained earth. I'm going to read that again because I don't like the way it's written. Due to God's faithfulness to his covenant, in which he proclaimed after the flood, he would sustain the cycles on which terrestrial life depends for as long as the earth endures, we deny that God's curse on the earth negates either the dominion mandate or the robustness and self-correcting resilience of the God-sustained earth. I have a friend of mine, he calls himself an evangelical Catholic. I'll let you think about that for a moment. His son is an evangelical Christian, and my friend is always trying to get his son involved in fighting the abortion issue and fighting the descent of our schools into, well, you know where it's going. And he keeps saying, Dad, look, do you polish the brass or do you reorganize the lawn chairs or deck chairs on the Titanic? No, the Titanic is going down. Let it go down. We need to lay up things in heaven. So we need to focus on God and not on what's happening on this earth. I've looked throughout the Bible. I can't find anywhere in there where it says, if you think we are near the last days, then Matthew 22 no longer applies. All bets are now off. Simply look to God, sit back, and just be one with him. I don't see that anywhere. It says continue right up until the end. And so that's what we need to do is continue. I think his son's wrong. I think he's right to try to push his son along. His son has pulled his kids out of public school. He's praying for others. I get that. But we can't simply just say, hey, this is a Titanic, let it sink. We've got to stay on board and keep fighting these issues. So with that, I'll move on to part 3. It's almost 10 o'clock. Wow, it was 2 in the afternoon when I started. Wow. Any event, I guess that somebody's fixed the clock. Good. Any event, I'll turn it